This video is about Plato's dialogue about military courage. It's called the Lekis, and it's a conversation between Socrates and two military generals, two men who had established the highest reputations for themselves based on their ability to win battles. Lekis was especially famous for being able to inspire his troops, lead them into dangerous situations, and behaving courageously in very precarious circumstances. And Nikias was notorious or well known for being a great strategist. So he took an intellectual approach to war and calculated how to win. And so they're sort of yin and yang. They balance against each other. Nikias sort of represents the military brass, the ones who give orders, and Lekis is the one who takes the orders and inspires the troops and leads them into battle. Nikias earned his reputation by fighting in battles, but his main excellence was Prometheus, planning ahead. He was very good at planning ahead and calculating and knowing how to win. The dialogue is set at a time when Nikias now has been elected president of Athens because of his military career. He has shown to the Athenians that he cares about the well-being of Athens and particularly its security. Right now is a critical time in the history of the area because Athens and Sparta have been fighting. They are the two most powerful city-states, and they're fighting to determine who's going to sort of run the area. And the Spartans have surrendered unconditionally at the point in time when the dialogue takes place. The Spartans had never surrendered unconditionally before in the history of their city-state. But so Athens has a golden opportunity to make a peaceful treaty and to stop the war. The trouble is that they don't. What you know afterwards is that they made a treaty that was punitive, and the Spartans just didn't accept it, and they fought back, and eventually the Spartans won. So the Athenians did win. They should have won the war, but because of their arrogance and their taking revenge, their punitive treaty, they ended up eventually losing. So Nikias is president at this time, which is very interesting because he was part of the treaty. He was president when the treaty was made. And so he's made a terrible mistake. Either he is a great strategist for conducting war, but a terrible strategist for creating peace, or else the dialogue indicates that the problem might have been that the Athenians wanted a punitive treaty, and they didn't respect Nikias if he wanted a less vengeful treaty. The fact that I'm not going to say which one. In some ways, I don't know the history well enough. In other ways, who does? Maybe historians might not get that right. But the main point, I think, is that we're talking about archetypes. So at different points in history, either one of these two mistakes could occur in analogous situations where you have someone who has this intellectual bent, who's been successful, but either he's good at war and terrible at treaties and peace, or he's become too intellectual and lost the respect of the boots on the ground types like Lekis, and the people won't accept his idea of what kind of treaty to make, and they vote for a punitive treaty. So to say that Nikias is one or the other sort of distracts us from what we can learn from this dialogue. We could learn either way. The other thing to point out is that there are three main characters: Socrates, Lekis, and Nikias. They definitely embody their argument. So in Plato, there's no gap between someone's argument, their logos, and their way of life, their ergon, which of course is also true in Homer. People decide on what to do and why is very much a reflection of their character. Their character causes them to be blind, to apply the wrong principle, or to apply a good principle but in the right way. So we all know that there's this inseparability between the way people think and their character. And this is also true in Plato's dialogues. And then Aristotle says that rational courage is the ability to face situations involving fear, particularly death in war and early death in war, but all positions related to fear, such as fear of survival in general, fear of loss of reputation, ostracism, humiliation, fear of disease, fear of pain, all of those things. And there's many fearful things because life is vulnerable. Human life is vulnerable. So that's why courage for Aristotle was one of the main virtues, because so much of human history and so much of the capacity of politicians to manipulate people is based on fear and the use of political rhetoric to appeal to fear and get people to do things that are totally wrong, lead to disaster. Rational courage is to face fear for the right reason, in the right way, at the right time. And Socrates represents rational courage. He embodies the person who has it. He does that throughout Plato's dialogues, but I will just talk about it in this dialogue. Lekis, on the other hand, embodies the extreme of being rash, of overreacting, of not thinking enough. He wants to prove himself courageous in a dangerous situation, especially war, and he doesn't think about it enough. Nikias, on the other hand, he thinks too much, and he defines courage as primarily an intellectual virtue, and he detaches it from particular circumstances. And so courage is a practical virtue. It's one that has to be exercised in a critical moment. And so Nikias can come up with these wonderful definitions, but the reader knows that when the critical moment came in terms of making the right treaty or convincing his people, having the practical wisdom to convince his people, the courage to admit he was wrong, all of these things, he fails. So the other definition Aristotle has is, he says, confidence appears to be courage, but whenever it's caused either by a professional soldier who already knows he's going to win a battle, and then that's not real confidence, because you know you're not really facing fear, or confidence by someone who is going to die but doesn't know it. He's ignorant, so he thinks it's a safe situation. that kind of confidence is not really courage. On the one hand, then you know too much. On the other hand, you know too little. Um, and then high spiritedness, as I said about Achilles, it was the great loss, because if Achilles had been treated well and Agamemnon had ruled for the well-being of the ruled, then Achilles would have thrived and been a great leader. It was a great loss. Okay, in this dialogue, Lekis is the one who's high-spirited, and that comes out in the dialogue. He's also the one that's teachable. He's the one that admits he doesn't know, and then he and Socrates together question Nikias, and Lekis clearly has learned from Socrates and from the questioning that he received, because he asks Nikias some pretty good questions. On the other hand, Nikias thinks he knows more than he knows, and Nikias has the courage of a professional soldier that isn't really courage at all. It's just the intelligence to keep yourself out of trouble. So Nikias thinks too much and can't act in a critical moment. Lekis thinks too little and acts too soon without thinking, and Socrates represents the mean between extremes. And Lekis says that. He says, I trust Socrates because I've seen him in battle. He was at Delium, and he acted bravely even when we were losing, and it was a very fearful situation. So I will talk to Socrates about courage because I trust him. Nikias, on the other hand, said, I will talk to Socrates about courage because I trust him, because he gets us to examine our lives. He believes in living an examined life, not just acting on the basis of emotions or habits or imitating other people, but on the basis of thought and definition. So Socrates gains both of their trust, and then at the end of the dialogue, when a definition of courage is not found, Socrates says we have to have the moral courage to admit that we're ignorant, even though we have this reputation for being wise. And we have to go back to school and we have to study this. And this is important. That does take a lot of moral courage. And if you don't have it, you're guilty of hubris, arrogance, overstepping your bounds, thinking you know what you don't know, being willing to act without knowledge. These are all hubris. So, so that's the main thing, is my main point from using Aristotle's discussion of courage, is that each of these characters embodies the different aspects of courage that Aristotle talks about in his ethics. So just to summarize, rational courage is Socrates. Citizen courage, the courage of the citizen soldier who will do what the rulers tell him, is Lekis, without questioning whether what the rulers say is actually just, or whether going into a particular battle is appropriate, or whether he's being asked to massacre people rather than to engage in just war. Lekis doesn't get that. He has the courage of the citizen soldier, he has high-spiritedness, and he has confidence based on ignorance. On the other hand, Nikias has the pseudo-courage of the professional soldier. He has the capacity for calculation, but he's optimistic and confident simply because he thinks he's in control and he knows the situation. Alright, so the way this dialogue begins, another point I want to make, the next point, is that we can take Aristotle's categories and apply them to Homer, But we can also take them with Plato. It's just that we have now a different context. We have a different city, a different kind of society. So in Homer, you had the Federation of Tribes in, on the Achaean side, and you had a monarchy on the Trojan side. But then Athens is a democracy by lot. The people make these decisions. They vote on whether to go to war, they vote on how many ships to send to a certain battle, they vote on whether to go into Sicily or wherever they're going. And so the power to persuade the people becomes the ultimate power. But anyway, you have a different kind of city, and you have different kinds of virtues and vices that people have. And one of the vices that comes out is the democratic personality. This There weren't any democratic personalities in Homer because people just didn't live this way. The democratic personality is somebody who's basically dissipated. He doesn't have to go to war. He can choose to go to war or not go to war. He can choose to develop himself or not develop himself. He can choose to go on a diet or stuff himself. He can choose everything is just a matter of choice and moral relativism, and that's considered freedom. And Athens now has fallen in love with this kind of freedom. Now, Plato shows that that was not the original intent of Athens. Athens was supposed to be the city dedicated to wisdom. And the Athenians they show that they have this self-righteousness about Sparta and Troy. Sparta was the city dedicated to war, like what happened to the Achaeans when they got into power struggles. And Troy was the city dedicated to wealth. And the Athenians supposedly are superior because they're dedicated to wisdom and to educating themselves and to reciting Homer in front of the people, and the people learn, or having tragedies presented to the people so they learn these lessons. So the Athenians thought they were organized to develop an educated citizenry, and that made them superior. Plato is showing that that view is corrupted so that people were free to do whatever they wanted. If they wanted to use the system to get rich, they got rich. If they wanted to use the system to join the military and try to take the city to war to build a military empire, they were free to do that. If they wanted to basically do nothing, they were free to do that. There was no accountability, and there was no educational system. Everybody educated their children in whatever way they wanted to. But if you really wanted your children to be powerful, you made sure to hire a sophist who taught them how to speak persuasively. So that's the context within which this conversation is going on. That's the city of Athens, and as opposed to the city of the Achaeans or the city of Troy. The next point is that the conversation is going on in a private household, as opposed to the conversations that take place in the midst of battle, in the tents when they're reflecting on their situation. That's somewhat similar, but Plato's point here is that the overall reason why Athens became corrupt and fell was what was going on long term, over time, in people's reflections on good and evil, justice and injustice, and how to educate the youth to become wise, so that when they came of age, they would become lovers of wisdom. And the dialogue shows, Plato's dialogue show how absolutely confused the Athenians were, and how they did exactly what the Achaeans and the Trojans did, in the sense of they completely lost track of the final cause, wisdom, and they developed the false cause, freedom, freedom for its own sake. So this was the corruption of democracy, and this is its effect on the military. Um, okay, so uh, it's interesting that a dialogue about courage starts out with discussion about the education of the youth, the educational system. And it also starts out, okay, so Socrates is in the house of four men, Nikias, Lekis, and then um, Lysimachus and Milesius, who are the same age as Nikias and Lekis, or they're older, but they have sons the same age. So they all have children or grandchildren the same age, and they're worried about how to educate these young children. Basically, they're just coming of age. And they want to know how we should educate them. So it's pretty clear that moral relativism has got a grip on Athens because there's no universal system of education, so there's no underlying view of the human psyche and of virtues and vices and of what you're aiming for. If you don't know what you're aiming for, how on earth are you going to know how to get there? And it's pretty clear that the Athenians are lost. The thing is, they know they're lost, and they're starting to ask about it. So what happened was, Lysimachus and Milesius are saying that their grandfathers were very noble people. They were good in war and they were good leaders, and that was the era when the Greeks were fighting against the Persians, and the Persians were universally bad. The Greeks were wonderful. The Greeks won, and they thought this is a confirmation of their virtues and their values, and the gods are on their side. But then they started fighting between each other, Sparta and Athens. And there was a lot more moral confusion about good and evil and a lot more questioning of what's going on. So the Peace of Nikias, again, is another golden opportunity for the Athenians to show not only the Spartans but the whole area that they value wisdom more than wealth or military empire, because they want to create a treaty that will stabilize the area, give people leisure time so that they can cultivate science, the arts, all that other wonderful stuff. They would represent that they live by the rule of law and that they're willing to exercise justice tempered with mercy and all this other wonderful stuff. It's just that they don't do it. So, Lysimachus and Milesius talk about their grandfathers as having been noble people, but they themselves lived during this era of the questionable wars, and they let themselves become dissipated. They were those democratic personalities, and they've never amounted to anything. They don't have good reputations as being good soldiers or good leaders, and they don't want that to happen to their children. And their children agree. They want to be noble like their grandfathers. This just reminds me so much of the 60s generation. That was when I grew up. So when I first read this, I'm going, oh, this really sounds familiar. But the question that they're talking about here is someone has come to town to teach the young people how to fight in armor. Okay, and so is this an important skill to learn? And Nikias and Lekis say, well, let's get into a conversation about this. And they ask Socrates to get engaged. Even though Socrates is actually younger than them, they trust him. And because the young people really like Socrates, they like Socrates for their own reasons. Socrates is really considered sort of an authority at this point, an informal one, because he's just a stonecutter. But they're willing to trust him as kind of the director of the conversation, which is completely out of line with the normal hierarchy. And that's important because in the military, hierarchy is a big deal. So they are willing to step outside of the normal chain of command and let a mere stonecutter guide the discussion. So, Nikias, his response is fighting in armor good. Well, you can tell that Nikias' response is that of a professional soldier. And what he says, and that of a very confused president. Because he says, well, it's better than most of the things the young people are doing. So you have this picture of young people just flailing around doing whatever they want, and a president who doesn't know what the heck to do about it. Hasn't taken charge. There's no agreed upon system of education. The president doesn't say, well, I have this view of the soul and I try to impose it and people refuse it. He doesn't he seems to be totally clueless. So he argues for it because it will improve their bodies physically, fighting in armor. Well, the answer to that is the Olympics was set up to try and get people, young men, to be physically fit so they could eventually fight in war. But the Olympics was a way to do it by creating a peaceful opportunity for competition, by binding people together under the rule of law. I have a whole video about the Olympics and how that was an incredibly ingenious way to use the need to keep young people strong for war in a context of binding people from different city-states together under common laws and rules, getting them to compete, getting them to meet each other, talk to each other, so that you'd have much less. You could prevent war. And so the fact that Nikias says fighting in armor is a good way to make their bodies healthy is like you forgot about the Olympics. And part of the reason they forgot is because that has been pseudo-professionalized. A very few athletes, a few young men train highly, and the rest of them seem to be couch potatoes, which President Nikias should pay attention to. He also says it's good to prepare them for how to use the instruments of war. It's to an advantage to them personally. And so he's doing this in terms of personal cost-benefit analysis, their own survival. They'll be better at defending themselves when the ranks are broken. It will lead to a study of military tactics, which means this would be good because it'd be a good career starter. So he's thinking in terms of a military career. And then and then his last thing is that they will appear to be more frightening to the enemy because they have had this experience. So he's really concerned with, his mentality is to tell the soldiers they should care about self-preservation, the appearance of being brave rather than necessarily brave, and the career opportunity. So if that doesn't remind you of the way military signs people up as a career opportunity, I don't know what else does. But Plato thought that was a problem. And then Lekis has a very different view. He doesn't like what Nikias says at all. And he says, well, Nikias, you're president, so I don't want to interrupt or, disagree with you too much, but I always look to the Spartans to find out how to train people for courage in battle, because the Spartans' entire goal, their whole city, is structured around military victory. And it becomes pretty clear that Laches admires the Spartans more than the Athenians. He says, they value courage in war in a way that the Athenians value tragedy in the arts. And Laches prefers the courage in war. And he says the Spartans don't teach their young people this. And so I don't think it's probably very good. We should take our cues from them. Um, and the other thing was, he says, Laches is very much, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Okay, show me. So the guy who teaches this, the guy who's going to get your money by coming and teaching the youth, himself humiliated himself in war, so it didn't help him. Um, and Laches thought, if you don't do this, if you don't have a reputation for having been a good soldier, I don't want to listen to what you're trying to make money teaching kids to do. And the other thing is that if a cowardly person learns this skill, he'll act rashly, okay? He'll go into dangerous situations and then run away. So there will just get a tool. It will be a tool for a basically cowardly person to think that he can fight when he can't. And then if a brave person has the skill and makes the smallest mistake, okay, then he'll be subject to criticism, because people will say, well, you were supposed to be this guy who had this wonderful training, and then you make a mistake, so you're humiliated. And then also, Laches is thinking about how the troops compete and compare with each other. And then his final point is that a person who pretends to know and to be a little better because he had this course in how to fight in armor will be envied by his comrades, and then they'll take pleasure in watching him fail. So basically, it sets up inequality among the troops, that some of them can afford to learn how to fight in armor, and they'll think that they're better, and they'll make bad judgments. They'll be rash. They'll go into a situation they can't handle, or they'll generate the envy of other troops. He's such a hoity-toity, he thinks he's so great, and actually they will want to watch their own comrade falter or fail. And so it's very interesting that Laches looks at it from the point of view of the boots on the ground and the emotions of the troops that are right on the ground. Nikias looks at it from the point of view of intellectual, of the beginning of a career opportunity, of self-preservation when there aren't any other comrades around, very much individual calculation of one's own self-interest, preservation, survival, economic, and professional, and also respect. Okay, so then Socrates says, oh dear, we don't agree, you don't agree, so what are we going to do now? And Lysimachus says, well, let's just take a vote. Socrates, whatever you vote will majority rule, because that's the way they run Athens. And Socrates says, no. No, the majority might be ignorant, so we can't let it reduce to that, which of course is what's going on throughout Athens. All sorts of stupid decisions are being made because the majority are ignorant, and they're being manipulated by the leaders, power-hungry leaders who could afford to pay a sophist to teach them how to persuade the public. So just like if you're a soldier and you're rich enough to take these lessons, you're a problem, right? It doesn't make the military better, it makes them worse. Um, People who can afford a sophist and manipulate people so that majority rules, the decisions that are made are actually wrong, is also a huge mistake, and it's driving Athens into the ground. So the subject matter here, says Socrates, is education, which is the most important question of all. And Socrates says more than once that if you really care about war and preventing war, you have to focus on the education of the youth and the values of the people. If people are greedy, you're going to get war. If people are power hungry, you're going to get war. And then if you really want people to value wisdom, you have to start with the youth and you have to educate them. Okay, now Lekis says that some people have expertise without having education. They just sort of learn it through experience. And Socrates says, and this was what Aristotle said, yes, but the teachers who know the cause, right, can teach and pass it on to other people. And that's important. They're the master craftsmen, the ones that know the cause. And then we have to ask, who are the teachers who are themselves good people? They have students that become good people, or they've been our teachers. He asks Nikias and Lekis. And Socrates says, I haven't had a teacher. I wish I had a teacher. And Nikias and Lekis don't have teachers. And Socrates says, if you don't know who teaches it, and you don't know, if you're ignorant and you don't have a teacher, you shouldn't hand your sons over to just anybody who claims to be able to teach courage or virtue or whatever. So, this guy comes to town, he teaches this little skill. Socrates says, you have to be careful who you hand your children over to. And then Nikias says, oh, I knew it would come to this. Whenever Socrates is conversing with someone, that person has to submit to answering questions about himself concerning both his present manner of life and the life he's lived so far. And Nikias says, I find this kind of conversation pleasant. I enjoy this. I like to learn. And so he comes across as somewhat sincere and also positive, right? Eager to learn. Lekis says, well, I like discussion all right, if and only if the one discussing is clearly a person who is wise and virtuous. I don't want these talking heads. I don't want all these ethics professors who sit in their offices and talk about virtue, but really don't engage very much and have very isolated lives. They're never in very critical situations like war. He says, Lekis hates discussing virtue with people who are hypocrites or wicked. A person's words have to be in harmony with their character. And that's where he says, I saw Socrates fight bravely, so I trust him, and it's okay with me if Socrates wants us to examine our lives because I trust him. Okay, so let's define. Socrates says to Lekis, okay, Lekis, what is courage? And his first definition is, there's no difficulty defining that. If a man is willing to remain at his post and to defend himself against the enemy without running away, you may rest assured he is a man of courage. This is exactly citizen courage, right? He's been told to stand by his post and not run away, and he stands by his post and he doesn't run away. And that's his definition. And then Socrates points out, wait a second, but there's examples of Scythian horsemen who sometimes do retreat. And like he says, well, those are the horsemen, that doesn't count. The boots on the ground faces dangerous situations. Well, then Socrates says, the Spartan hoplites at Plataea. Okay, hoplites are the boots on the ground. So here's an example of the Spartans who retreated, and by doing that, they defeated the Persians. So they used strategy, which is, of course, what Nikias likes. They retreated, they let the Persians come into a mountain pass, then they surrounded them, and then they knocked them off. There were lots of examples where being passive aggressive worked, okay, not just standing by your post. And Lekis has to admit that. And so Socrates says, and it isn't just courage in war, it's courage in dangers at sea, illness, poverty, basically fighting desires and pleasures, the courage, overcoming a lot of fears and desires. And so his definition, Lakey's second definition, is a sort of power of the soul, endurance of the soul. And Socrates says, well, does it have to be accompanied by wisdom? What kind of endurance is it? And then Socrates gives that example. Suppose a person endures in battle, and his willingness to fight is based on wise calculation, because he knows that others are coming to his aid, and he will be fighting men who are fewer than those on his side and inferior to them, and in addition his position is stronger. Would you say that that man, with his kind of wisdom and preparation, endures more courageously, or a man in the opposite camp who's willing to remain and hold out? And Lekis responds, the person in the opposite camp. And Socrates says, but that would be foolish endurance. And Lekis says, well, you're right. And Socrates says, well, if that were the definition, people would be considered courageous who dive down into wells without any skill, who endure in any other similar situation because they're ignorant. They just don't know what they're doing. And Lekis says, what would anybody else say? Everybody thinks that's true. And Socrates says, but that's foolish endurance. That's not wise. And Lekis says, he gives up. He says, I'm not ready to give up, Socrates, although I'm not really accustomed to arguments of this kind, but an absolute desire for victory has seized me with respect to this conversation. And this is his thumos. This is what Achilles had a lot of. This desire to win, this aggression. And I'm really getting annoyed at being unable to express what I think in this way. I still think I know what courage is, but I can't understand how it's escaped me just now, so that I can't pin it down in words and say what it is. So the thing that's important about this is that Lekis, later in his life, and the reader will know this, that he has a false opinion about courage, and that leads to his own demise, his own tragic ending. So what happened, and the dialogue points directly to that. At Mantinea, he was on top of the hill. He and his troops were on top of the hill. They had complete strategic advantage over the Spartans. He was told to wait until they get reinforcements, because they really wanted to get, to plaster the Spartans. And if he got reinforcements, then they would. There was no question they were going to win. They had tremendous advantage, just like the example. And Lekis, either because of his personal opinion, that wouldn't be real courage. It's more courage to go down there now and kick those Spartans' butts. Or either because of this opinion and or because his other troops at the top told him, hey, Lekis, let's just go down there. What are you getting to be, a sissy? why do we shouldn't wait for all these other troops. Let's just prove ourselves. And that just, Lekis couldn't resist that. He couldn't bear to be called a sissy. And so he went. Either one, again, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows how the conversation actually went. But either way, his view that foolish endurance, that taking risks or being rash, basically, was more courageous than just waiting until you outnumber the enemy and you clearly can easily win. And because of that, they lost, and the tide of the war sort of changed. It was a pretty important battle. And so Lakes lost his reputation as a good general because of that. So, in all of Plato's dialogues, a false opinion leads to a tragic mistake. And that's where tragedy comes in throughout Plato's dialogues. Okay, so then once Lakes admits he's wrong, and okay, Socrates and I are going to ask Nikias, what is courage? Nikias says, every one of us is good with respect to that in which he's wise, and bad in respect to that in which he's ignorant. If a man is really courageous, it's clear that he's wise. Well, okay, Lakes says, what court of wisdom is this? Well, courage is knowledge of the fearful and the hopeful in war and in every other situation. And Lakes says, wait a second, that's wisdom, that's just not courage. So he thinks Nikias is claiming way too much. Courage has to do with war. It doesn't have to do with every sort of fearful and hopeful in every situation. And like he says, all the other craftsmen know what is to be feared and hoped for in their particular arts. But you wouldn't call a good shoemaker, what to fear if you get bad weather, leather, or what to hope for if you can buy good leather or something like that. They aren't called courageous. So Nikias is, way too comprehensive. Okay, so, and then Lakes thinks a doctor's knowledge of the sick amounts to something more than being able to describe health and disease. This is where Nikias says the doctor should have knowledge about health and disease. And whereas Lakes thinks a good doctor simply cures people. And this again was Aristotle's distinction between the practitioner and the master. So a good doctor, there's some doctors that can actually heal patients. They're very good at it, but they don't know the cause. Whereas others can teach the causes and teach other people how to heal, and sometimes they aren't quite as good, or they don't engage in as much of the actual practical healing individuals. Okay, so Lakes accuses Nikias of thinking he knows more than you know. Nikias says, don't you think, Lakes, that there's many cases in which it would be better not to get up from an illness? A doctor would know who he shouldn't cure because the person really ought to die. In some cases, to die is preferable than to live. And Lakes goes, he's calling the seers courageous, the priests, because who else knows? Who else but a priest would know if it's better for somebody to die or to live? And Nikias says, no, the seers tell us what's likely. They look into the future and they tell us what's going to happen. They know the signs of what is to be of the future. But other people know what is, to whom it is better to suffer or not suffer death or life, right? So the seer can simply say, look, if you do this, it will concur with the gods or it won't, or they see some eagle giving some sign that this is a good sign that the battle will go well or poorly. And Nikias says, but it's only a courageous person who can actually decide whether the battle ought to go well or poorly, and who really ought to suffer. And Lakey says, you're talking about some god. It's only a god that would know how to set up conditions to, for people, would know that who should die and who should live, who should suffer. A general should always do what's necessary to win a battle. A general should never decide that they're going to act in a way that their troops would get hurt because they've decided their side shouldn't win. Okay, and so Nikias, I mean, the reason that's important is that's exactly what Nikias did. He told the Athenians not to go to Sicily. Alcibiades said, let's go to Sicily, let's take it over because that's the breadbasket and we're tired of always having to worry about food. And Nikias says, we can't afford it. We're already fighting on two fronts. We can't afford to fight on a third front. The people in Sicily will definitely defend their island tooth and nail. We really can't do this. And so Alcibiades and Nikias spoke in front of the assembly. Alcibiades was a very charismatic guy. He just convinced the Athenians that Athens can do anything. Nikias is just a wimp. He's gotten weird in his old age. He's a coward. He's telling us we can't do this. No, we can do it. And Nikias says, no, it's terrible strategy. We're going to lose. So Nikias is the professional soldier. And he loses, right? The Athenians are guilty of pride. They don't think there's any limits. So Nikias, he loses. And he really thinks this is a huge mistake. And he thinks the Athenians have gotten arrogant, and he was a very religious guy. So the inference is that at a certain point he really didn't think the Athenians should even win. And what happened was Alcibiades was supposed to take the military campaign to Sicily, since he's the one who started it. But then he got accused of and or defamed some sacred statues of Hermes, and he was kicked out of Athens. He was ostracized. So Nikias was put in charge. So Nikias has to go over and fight in Sicily when he does not think it's strategically good. Then there was an eclipse of the moon right when he was toward the end, they were at the beach trying to head home, or they were being defeated, but there was an eclipse of the moon, and the seers said, you can't do anything for 2 weeks. And Nikias obeyed the seers against his judgment as a general. So what must have happened in Nikias' mind is that he made himself God. He decided that it was better for his men to get slaughtered and obey what the seers said was their duty to the gods than to act like a good general and protect his troops. And so he did act in exactly this way, that he decided he knew who should suffer and who shouldn't, and he decided his own men should suffer. And that was pretty arrogant. But then he lost his reputation, obviously. I think he lost his life too. But the main point is that the Athenians considered this completely unacceptable, which in a lot of ways it was. But he had that same kind of arrogance that shows in the dialogue. He thinks he knows all sorts of stuff that he doesn't know. And Lekis can recognize that Nikias is arrogant. Then Lekis asks, or Socrates starts another line of questioning. Are wild beasts courageous? And Lekis said, well, of course they are. Everybody thinks they are. And Nikias says, no, they aren't. They don't have understanding. They don't have intellect. You can't be courageous without intellect. And children are not courageous either. So, so the man in the street, Lakes types, will think that any kind of facing of fearful situations, wild beasts, children, anybody, is courage. And the professional soldiers, like Nikias, think, as Nikias says, that courage includes foresight. Prometheus is the word for foresight. But when they were in this huge conflict, Nikias suddenly realizes he can't alienate Lakes that much. He's totally alienated his own troops. So then he says, I declare that you are wise, and so long as you are courageous. And I say the same of a great many other Athenians. So Nikias realizes he's losing the trust of his own people and his own military. So he flatters Lakes, and Lakes understands that. He says, this is disgusting. And Socrates says, well, Nikias has learned all of this from the sophist, Prodicus, who he talks to a lot. And Lekis says, it's more fitting for a sophist to make clever distinction than for a man the city thinks worthy to be its leader. And so now you've got this other problem, which is true always in the military, is that this big gap between the military brass or the civilian leaders who send military to war and the actual boots on the ground. So the people who are the boots on the ground are less educated. They want to believe their leaders are giving them good advice. They want to fight for their country and be patriotic. But then if they start questioning these intellectuals and think the brass is abusing them and they're overly intellectual and they think they know who should live and die rather than just thinking about how to preserve. I mean, the point of war is you're being attacked by somebody who's truly threatening your life and your stability, and you're protecting your country against outside threats. And that's the responsible thing to do. But if you find out the leaders have all sorts of personal agendas and they make themselves into God, and they would even decide that their own city should lose and put their own troops in danger, that's a complete loss of trust on the part of the soldiers. And that's what happened with Achilles and Agamemnon. Agamemnon engaged in this terribly arrogant refusal to give back the daughter of the priest of Delphi. He's playing God, right? He made himself into God, and totally arrogant, and completely lost the trust of the troops. They all wanted to hightail it home after that, because all of a sudden they're not fighting for a just cause. They're fighting just to fight, and they're going against the gods. And this was what Lekis was thinking. Our president and our wonderful military general is arrogant, and I don't trust them anymore. Okay, so that's basically the main issue in the Lekis. And at the end, Socrates says that there's a power struggle between Nikias and Lekis because they both lost. But they both trust Socrates, and they want their sons to be educated by Socrates. And Socrates says we have to have moral courage, we have to go back to school. And the thing that's very interesting there is that this is during the Peace of Nikias. When they go back to war, it isn't very much longer after that that Socrates gets a reputation for not believing in the city